Now I'm joined by Edwin Frank, editorial director of NYBR Classics. What a pleasure to see you, Edwin.
Pleasure to see you.
Congratulations to this series of classics that you have rediscovered. And among them, there are many Chinese names from ancient China to contemporary China.
I am, among other things, also a poet, and I suppose my first introduction to Chinese culture was through Chinese poetry, which in some sense, at the beginning of modern poetry in English, is Ezra Pound's response to poetry in Chinese, which I think Chinese experts often say it gets everything wrong, but in some sense it helped to shape modern poetry in America, in England, in English in general, around images of the sort that are so frequent in Chinese poetry. So I think perhaps the first Chinese book that I published in the classic series was a reprint of a wonderful book from the 1960s by this British scholar A.C. Graham, his translation of poets of the late Tang, which starts with the late poetry of Du Fu and also Li Xiangyan, a whole range of poets. It's a wonderful book, both because the translations are beautiful, but also because Graham does a very good job explaining how differently Chinese poetry works from English poetry.
I know you yourself is a poet. So how differently?
Well, something that was very interesting for an American reader of poetry was that, again, partly influenced by Pound, when one saw Chinese poetry as a kind of series of limpid and transparent and simple images. And Graham made it clear that what works at one level as a direct image of physical reality, at another level works as a historical illusion, so that the poems are suffused with history as well as imagery.
Besides that, you're also publishing works related to contemporary China, to modern China. Elin Chang's work, for example, she is a well-known name in the Chinese community around the world, and yet to English readers, even though she wrote in English on some occasions, but not well known. So how did you discover her? What about her that made you echo in a way?
I often say that for me, she is the great discovery of the 20-some years that I've spent working editing the classic series. She of course lived in the United States for a long time, but she wasn't really well published in the United States. And I discovered her in a reference work. I think it was the Oxford book of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Literature in English translation. And perhaps it was even in a footnote where it said that her story, which is translated, she translated as The Golden Kang, was the equal of Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, and I can't remember, maybe Kafka's Metamorphosis, I don't know what. But in any case, what was interesting to me, these are standard comparisons of a great novella, but I had never heard of it. And I went to the library at Columbia University, the East Asian Library, and went into, really I had to go deep into it to find this anthology in which this translation she had done of her own story was included, and was immediately struck by what a wonderful writer this was, a writer who, again, beautiful imagery, extraordinarily filmic sense of time.
You know, just look at her life as a writer and as a woman could very well, in a way, inform your readers about what China was like and went through, you know, for the past 30 years during modern China, you know, the early 20th century. And what about the others?
Yes, well, I mean, I'm always interested in dealing with the foreign literature, in trying to get a picture of how that literature has existed over time and into our time. So on the one hand, having Ge Fei, who is writing about both historical novels like Peach Blossom Paradise, but also novels of contemporary life in Beijing, like Invisibility Cloak.
These works are part of your, what you call the New York Review of Books Classic project, in which you try to rediscover all the quote-unquote long-buried classics and make them available in front of the world who are hungry for real works and for masterpieces. And it has been a great success despite of earlier doubts many had about this. You know, it's a commercial success. It is certainly a great intellectual success. So tell me how you do this, because I remember you describe, you know, how to let people know about these works by saying, I don't want to promote them as the quote-unquote old Sex in the City book, because they're not, and the readers are smart. Tell me more about that. How did you, you know, explore these ideas?
Well, of course, it's a mainstay of American publishing everywhere, that you need to connect a book to some current book to make people take an interest in it. It's done all the time.
Yeah.
And of course, with contemporary books, there is some legitimacy to that, saying that this book is like that book. And even, of course, past books. But readers are smart, and readers know that you know, a book from 1920 is not going to be the same thing as a very, very current book like Sex and the City. Finding out what is, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I've said at a certain point that I want the books to be powerfully irrelevant, in that kind of pushing back against the notion that books from the past should immediately reproduce our ideas of the present. There's a wonderful moment in a great book from the past, which I don't publish, Nadezhda Mandelstam's memoir, Hope Against Hope. She was the wife of the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, where she describes the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova as saying, what do you want? And she says, I want a place where you'll find none of us. She's fed up with just hearing all the chit chat and talk and the opinionation of the moment. And so there is a way in which work from more or less recent past to the deep past can surprise us and astonish us out of our preconceptions, and in some ways set us free to think again. And this, in the case of the classics, I don't want people to think this is something you have to read in the class and have to say, this is good. I want people to say, this is something that raises questions about either books or how we see the world.
Does it help you to how you see the world as the editor of this series of classics?
Well, I mean, it has taught me all sorts of things that I just, by virtue of snooping around and hearing from scholars and writers and translators and so on, I have found out about literatures about which I knew very little, Hungarian literature and things like that, which have beautiful, beautiful and very unusual works, which, so in that sense, it is a continuing pleasure and education. You know, I mean, the Latin poets said that, Horace said that literature is supposed to instruct and delight, and I have been instructed and delighted by the work that I've done over the last 20 years.
You've been saying, Edwin, before I came into the studio, I did a little bit of research. You said you want things that is powerfully irrelevant. I like that. I think you might have put a lot of thoughts into it before you said that. Tell me more about that, and how is that related to where we are today?
It's an interesting time that we are both perhaps more broadly interested in people all over the world than ever before, but we aren't terribly interested, and I think increasingly aren't terribly knowledgeable about the past. And as a book that I publish famously begins with the sentence, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So the past, not only our own past, but the past of other countries and languages' past, are other places where we can learn to think differently and think differently about ourselves. And we would not, in our busyness and engagement with the questions of the day, of our day, the things that seem to us immediately relevant, necessarily ask those questions, and literature can ask them for us and ask us to listen to them.
History, if you look at history per se, it really helps us to understand the most 2 or 3 versions of what happened. And it usually is being written by winners, so to speak. And yet literature really complement what history has been about by describing quote unquote little people, ordinary people, real people. That is really amazing and treasurable.
Well, Elin Chang, I think, said that, that her inspiration and what she was interested in doing at a time when I think many writers felt that they had to write about historic events. She was interested in the little things that happened between men and women. And my understanding is that actually, the word she gave, that connects with the old Chinese word for the novel, which is something like small talk, or translates as something like small talk. But of course, small things are really very big things. Small things shape our days and shape our world.
Every individual has a tremendous amount of stories about them. About you, you also have quite some stories. Tell me about how this, cooperation with other publishing houses, particularly from a very different culture now, even the 2 countries, if you talk about politics, could be very different. How does this cooperation about culture, about language, about literature, amid a bigger picture of geopolitics, technology, all the changes that we have today?
Well, it's interesting because literature, on the one hand, I think is a space apart from that, and it's important that there be a space apart from the political and ideological disputes that exist between countries, and also the historical, it's not least because it's a place where, in fact, the larger historical origins of those disputes and the human experience that goes into those disputes can be recognized. And there's a way in which a book, the philosopher Martin Buber talked about the importance of an I, thou, to use an old English word, but an I-you relationship. And literature constitutes that relationship and constitutes it across boundaries, even as it doesn't deny boundaries. It also is a record of the very different things that happen to people and countries.
Now I know you are working on the book about the 20th century novel. It is very relevant to me in a way, because I really want to know how literature is helping us to discover and rediscover the 20th century. Some of us went through a little bit of, it was a dramatic time. Tell me more about how much you have researched and where are you today?
Well, as you say, the 20th century was a time of a catastrophic and disastrous time in many ways, but also a time of great opportunity in other ways, and of emerging new ways of understanding things, and and things that have benefited our lives, which are as simple as electricity or female suffrage, obviously, which is in sitting down to write this book, what I was really interested in is how literature, not in a specifically documentary sense, but in an imaginative sense, went on responding to these emerging, changing realities of the last century, and realities that in some sense made the novel one of certainly the preeminent form of imaginative literature in our world, all around the world. Because at the beginning of the century, in some ways, the novel was an entertainment for more or less advanced industrial, at the time, industrial societies, because you need a printing press to make a novel, in effect, and you need enough readers who are literate to make a novel sellable. By the end of the century, the novel was all over the world, and is, in some sense, our story had become the story of what kind of world we live in. And so this, and the different ways in which people thought about how to deal with that are things that interest me throughout the book.
Mr. Frank, during the 20th century, we went through several wars,
We
big,
did.
small. And then we also were tied up by certain ideologies, fed up by certain ideologies, confused by ideologies, and society changes. Technology is coming in a much faster speed than any other time, one could say. So how have all of this been reflected in literature? Literature, particularly novel, did they really capture the spirit of the time?
Well, I mean, it has been the struggle. I mean, it is what I'm calling the 20th century novel, which is not every novel written in the 20th century. Many novels are escapes from the 20th century, and escape is a perfectly understandable thing given the century the 20th century was. But whether you start with somebody like H.G. Wells, who is, of course, right at the beginning of the century, trying to imagine a new kind of literature, science fiction, which will imagine the effects that technology will have on our lives in the future, or whether we take, excuse me again for my, but Zhang Zhensheng, I think, is the Fortress Besieged, the great, who is writing about his hero displaced by the war in China and working across a war-torn China, but is at the same time writing an extraordinary social comedy of people displaced socially in so many ways and trying to make sense of their lives, and also emotionally displaced, because it's also a great novel of unhappy marriage. You have somebody dealing with, what's the phrase? It's a 20th century phrase, the facts on the ground of our of day-to-day existence, which is often a question of combat.
Very interesting discussion. Edwin Frank, editorial director of NYRB Classics. What a pleasure. Congratulations for your wonderful work.